This is a conversation with Matthew Savill. Matthew is a director of military sciences at the Royal United Services Institute, and he has over 20 years of experience working on defense, intelligence, and national security in leadership positions in the British Civil Service. And in this conversation, we talk about the current state of the British military, which, according to many, is not great. We discuss whether the British military is in a crisis and how bad it actually is. Why is the British Army becoming smaller than ever before in the last 200 years, at a time of a growing threat to Europe? Whether Britain can still afford to maintain a blue water navy, or why does it have smaller armed forces than France, despite spending more money on it? The corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And it's also supported by generous patrons that you can join to help make this sustainable and get various perks. And now, enjoy the conversation. All right, so welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Well, glad to join you.
I'd like to talk about the current state of the British military. And I think a good question to begin with is, what is the reality of today? Because there has been a lot of claims and announcements and proclamations from British civil servants and politicians and independent experts, including yourself, who publicly expressed alarm about the shape of the British military. With some claiming that the British armed forces are in a crisis. And so I think the question to start with is really the British military in crisis, and how bad the situation is?
Yes, thank you. I think, I mean, to start with, I would say the language I think I used in a commentary that I wrote a few months ago was that the forces were hollowed out. And that's language actually that's been used by a previous, fairly recent Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace. It's worth starting by saying the UK still has capable armed forces. So they still have well-trained people. They have a range of good capabilities. And when they can field them, some very effective forces. You know, they have modern F-35 aircraft. They have two still relatively new, large aircraft carriers. They're going to be getting new tanks, although they're a few years away. The Navy has some excellent submarines. The general quality of UK personnel remains pretty good. They can still do a lot overseas. There are UK personnel deployed around the world every day of the year doing something. But I think there are two main problems that have become apparent recently, and they're related to each other. The first is that in the wake of other people's experiences recently, and we can look at the Middle East, but we particularly look at Ukraine, it seems that the UK is not ready for major armed conflict. And by that we mean a clash of states that engages in what we sometimes call peer conflict, i.e. someone comparable with us, or you could call industrial war. That massed clash of arms that involves tens of thousands of people fighting on the land, at sea, in the air, and increasingly using capabilities in cyberspace and from or through outer space. And the issue there is that the UK's armed forces have become quite small. They are, if you like, brittle in some cases. So they couldn't take much in the way of casualties. The Russians have recently been taking 1,200 casualties a day. So September appears to have been the deadliest month in the conflict so far. So they're taking thousands and thousands of people each week killed and injured. If you applied those casualties to the UK armed forces, they would be out of the war in a matter of weeks and would take years to recover. Now, the UK wouldn't fight the same way that Russia's fighting. It's taking casualties because it it acts and fights in a way where they are prepared to take enormous losses for the gains that they are achieving. But even the Ukrainians are taking hundreds of casualties in the same period. And so problem number one is that it feels like the UK's armed forces have dropped below critical mass, as it's called. That they can make a contribution, but ultimately they have no resilience. We've seen this in stockpiles as well, that if the UK had to fight a major war, it would run out of artillery shells in weeks. It would run out of precision-guided missiles in weeks or a couple of months. Related to this is a second problem, which is that the evolution that is taking place in warfare has demonstrated that in certain critical areas we are short, that we have taken risk in some areas, as it's called, and not really updated some of our capabilities, and now we are lagging. And that actually, there's a sort of hidden third problem here, which is that the UK's armed forces don't match up to our perception of ourselves. So we are a nuclear power, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and now the third largest spender in NATO. And it feels like what we don't have are the armed forces that £56 billion a year should buy. And we have historically tried to maintain what is called a full spectrum capability, which means you can do a little bit of everything. I mean, if you asked a British officer what that meant, they would probably say, we look like the US, but we're just a bit smaller, or a lot smaller. And that's not true either. We have gapped and taken risk in a number of cases. And so that leads you to this conclusion that the armed forces are still pretty capable for a wide range of tasks, but they fundamentally are not prepared for modern conflict. And a recent report by the committee, the Defence Committee in the House of Commons, basically said this. RUSI's been kind of picking at this for a while, and now there's been a Lords Committee that has said this. And I think in calling for a defence review and running one now, the current government has also accepted this.
I want to talk in more detail about everything, all the three problems that you've described just now. But maybe to add on that, I sense that another aspect or factor why there's this shock, if I can call it that way, about the capability of the British Armed Forces is because for a long time, maybe just to emphasize that all of the problems that you've highlighted are not unique to Britain, but would apply to most European countries, and they have all hollowed out or most of them hollowed out their armed forces. But I feel like the shock comes from the fact that Britain probably saw itself and was seen by the rest of Europe as a country that still maintained a significant military capability. And so maybe we're all a little surprised that might not actually be the case so much.
Yes, and I think it's fair to also point out the armed forces have usually been able to achieve or do something when asked. There is this thing called the conspiracy of optimism. And the Iraq inquiry here in the UK talked a little bit about this in terms of it was difficult to get messages through about how things weren't going as well as we would have liked in Iraq because of the conspiracy of optimism, like we can do something. And one of the challenges with inside defence for the past 10 to 15 years is that numbers have been cut, but we are constantly looking for efficiencies, save money, but somehow do more with less. That's put enormous pressure on both equipment and people. People are one of the biggest issues. It's not just the technology, it's people. And we have, the British cliche, robbed Peter to pay Paul. We've put enormous stress on the system. Somehow the armed forces have always been able to kind of, make do and mend, achieve something, get the ship deployed, get something there on time. That has created additional stress in the system. There's been very little of, no, this is impossible. And now we can't do this. And so we project a can-do mentality to ministers and internationally. And it's probably only fairly recently that we've really begun to fall short. The problems have been there for some time, from even before, say, the 2010 Defence Review. People have been talking about running hot almost the entire time that I was in government. I used to be an MOD civil servant. But it's become more and more stark recently.
I think, just to a little tangent here, or to follow up on what you said, that's kind of the problem of what soldiers are supposed to do, or military personnel, because their part of their job is to just work with what they have, even if it's not enough. And part of, I think, being in the military, from my experience of working with military personnel of different countries, is just the mentality of being able to work and get the job done, even though the conditions are not ideal.
Yes, and that can be an enormous positive. It's what enables people to succeed in the face of impossible odds. It's what enables them to take on what look like lost causes and turn them around. And leadership requires a degree of positivity and initiative. The difficulty is that what that can do is conceal weakness in the system. And I think, if we talk about personnel, armed forces morale, you can measure this, has been eroded because there is an internal tension in some of the forces that some people don't feel the messages about the stress is getting through, or that it is being ignored at the top levels, because we can always somehow muddle through. That's a very particularly British pathology to kind of muddle through or improvise. But that means that it takes quite a lot to go wrong before policymakers, or politicians in particular, have the full range of challenges exposed to them. And there's a question there of honesty and speaking truth to power that I think has caused a degree of corrosion of trust within the forces of their belief in politicians, but also their own leadership. And you can see that in the personnel reporting on what's known as the offer: pay, conditions, infrastructure, housing, the terms that apply to how people are then effectively employed in the armed forces.
So to start with the first problem that you've mentioned, according to the head of the British Army, and I think that he actually said it at an event held by RUSI, Britain must be, quote, ready to fight in 3 years, which is not that different from what a lot of other heads of armed forces are saying in different European countries. But how ready is Britain to fight today in a major conflict as we've seen in Ukraine, and how much would have to change in those 3 years? And is it even realistic for so much to change for that to happen?
Yes, this is the classic of it depends on what you want it to do. Britain could fight now. Britain could deploy a range of forces as part of a response to, let's say we're talking about a major war in Europe where the adversary was somebody like Russia, or something happened in the Middle East that threatened our interests. The UK could deploy a whole range of different forces to be involved in that conflict. What would happen, though, is two things. One, there would be an enormous premium on protecting those forces because we have very little in the way of resilience. Any losses would be significant. The loss of a single submarine or a single frigate or destroyer would change what the Navy can do, because the number of deployable ships and submarines is so small. We've gone long periods without one of our attack submarines being deployed in the past year. We can normally only get one or two fully worked up and deployed at any given time. So losing one is 50% or 100% of your deployed submarine force. In terms of frigates and destroyers, we aim to maybe have 6 or 7 deployed and operational at any given point. Losing one would be a big deal. The same is true for casualties in land forces. The other thing is that the UK would be reliant on other people for a lot of its capabilities. So a good example would be airborne early warning. We got rid of our E-3 Sentry aircraft. We're in the process of buying an airborne radar and control system called Wedgetail. It basically scans the airspace. It sees what other enemy aircraft or missiles are out there, and also it communicates and coordinates your air forces. Well, we're only buying 3 of those, which means you can't guarantee having one up. So we would need another ally to do that. If we deployed a land force, that land force would probably have some very short-ranged, ground-based air defences to protect against incoming missiles or drones. But that would only be really a system called Starstreak, which is a very, very short-range missile that you use against drones or helicopters. We are bringing in a kind of still relatively short-range but capable missile system called Sky Sabre. But we have a handful of batteries, so not enough to defend a full brigade or division. So we'd have to ask somebody else, please can you defend our brigade or division? We have a reasonable amount of combat engineering equipment, bridging and the like, but not enough to cover a whole division, say. And so on and so forth. We've got an aircraft carrier at the moment, but we've only got 1 squadron's worth of F-35s currently rated for deployment from that carrier. We're hoping to have 2 by the end of this year. So the impact of the carrier will be limited unless some US Marine Corps F-35s were on board. So are we ready to fight now? Well, we're certainly ready to fight somebody now, but it's all about the scale of the UK contribution and how much it would be able to do all that was necessary without working with others. Now, the answer from the MOD will always be, we're part of NATO. NATO is an alliance, and allies cover for each other. That is true, but there are a couple of drawbacks with taking that approach. The first is that, again, that self-perception angle. We don't really want to be a country that has to rely on others. We want to bring the enablers for others. If we're going to punch at our weight, never mind punching above our weight, but our weight is P5 member who has the 3rd largest defence budget in NATO. Okay, so that means you shouldn't be asking other allies for help. You should be the one providing the help. So that just doesn't accord with our perception of ourselves. The other problem is that basically begins to let other people down or place pressure on them. NATO has to coordinate even more who is doing what. And it's a bit embarrassing for one of the major powers to turn up and be asking other people and putting pressure on other people to cover for its weaknesses. And that's before you have interoperability questions. How well does all of this stuff work together? So suddenly the UK is not providing a sovereign capability. And again, I think the government's acknowledged this. For example, NATO levies requirements against all of its members, where it says, please can you tell us what you have available and that would be declared to NATO in the event of a NATO crisis. And what the UK has done for several years is say it has a certain quantity of land forces available and then not actually be able to deploy them. So we rank very poorly in the list of people providing land power. So we're on the hook to provide a capability that we currently can't. And so that's why it comes back to, are we ready to fight? We're ready to do something. We're not actually ready to fulfill our commitments, things that we have put on paper with NATO. That's the state of where we are. And I think that's partly why the General Walker, he was talking at the Land Warfare Conference, was talking about the military more broadly. He also has quite ambitious plans for the army specifically and where he wants it to be in 3 years.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now back to the conversation. And well, let's maybe get into that because obviously, in the context of a possible war in Europe, it would be, in particular, the ground forces or land forces that would play a really significant role. But at the same time, the British Army, in terms of personnel, is at its lowest levels since the early 1800s. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that it's predicted to either keep decreasing in the short-term future or remain relatively at the same levels. So I guess I have a number of questions about that, but basically, why were the numbers of the British army reduced so much? And is there a plan to significantly increase them at some point? And that kind of follows up on the claim about being ready to fight in 3 years. Is it realistic that something would actually change enough in those 3 years if we accept that Britain is not in a great best situation to fight today? Can that much change in those 3 years, or will it change?
So the first problem for the army in particular is that people are expensive, and the people bit, the personnel bit of costs, is one of the largest bits of the defence budget. And the army is bigger than the Navy and the Air Force put together. And so it's always under pressure on the people side of the budget. The second problem that the army has is that it breaks down into smaller pieces, deployable elements or forces, that mean if you're trying to save money, it's more attractive to trim the army. Because if you trim the Navy, for example, obviously the Navy has a huge range of capabilities. I don't want to give the impression the Navy is literally just frigates and destroyers and submarines or aircraft carriers. Like, it has a whole range of very smaller ships, mine hunters, deep sea salvage capabilities. We mustn't forget the Royal Fleet Auxiliary in this as part of the wider naval service. But at its core, you have a certain number of people that you need to crew a ship, and that means the size of the element that you can cut kind of comes in these big increments. So if you don't want to cut a ship, and you want to keep crewing it and deploying it, that kind of drives the size of your force. You might find that 10 more people, maybe you can do some lean crewing, or you can move people around. I mean, the Navy has done that, and that's why it's got stress in the system. But ultimately, you think in terms of ships, and then that drives your numbers. The problem for the army is you can easily cut 150 people, 200 people, and go, well, I'll spread that out over a series of units. These battalions, I'll keep all of these battalions. I don't want to cut what's called the cat badges, i.e. the history and the particular association, maybe the focus of a regiment. But if I just make them all a bit smaller. And so what you do is and all of the unit sizes are flexible anyway. Like, how big is a brigade? Well, a small brigade might only be 3,000 to 4,000 people. A really large brigade, you might be looking at 6, maybe even 8. When we deployed in Helmand, at the height of the counterinsurgency, we had nearly 10,000 people deployed under one brigade headquarters. Now, in truth, that was a brigade headquarters and a logistics headquarters and lots of other stuff stuck on. You would never really deploy a brigade at that size. But there's such flexibility in what it looks like on paper that you can say, well, I've still got 2 divisions, but there's nothing in those divisions. I've still got all of these battalions, but all the battalions are smaller. Oh, well, I've still got some tank regiments. I've just thinned them all out. So the problem for the army is both that its people is big and expensive compared to the other forces. It's easy. I mean, it shouldn't be easy, but it sometimes ends up being easy to just trim it a little bit. And then you go, oh, well, we can still be more efficient. And my force of 72,000 can basically do the same as the force of 80,000. Now, actually, it can't. But we tell ourselves it can. So those are the 2 problems that create pressure on army numbers. So we've gone from 20 years ago an army of just over 100,000, and we were sustaining then 2 big land conflicts. And then the 2010 SDSR cut the army to 83,000, and then it worked out it hadn't done the maths quite right, so we needed to trim it a bit more. And then we headed towards 80,000. And then we had, we won't go below 72,000. And now, because of retention issues, we might duck below 70,000 in the next year. Now, in my lifetime, that is unprecedented, to have an army that small. And that does have a material impact on the force you can deploy at the far end and its resilience. How many casualties can you take?
And I guess what you were describing with how it works with trimming the force and sort of keeping in theory, the divisions and then the brigades, but actually decreasing the numbers that make them up. That's the hollowing out that you were talking about, that in theory, you still have all those capabilities, but in practice, you don't.
Yes, what you don't have is the volume. So we still have a broad range of things that support the deployment of a brigade and a division. But when you scratch beneath the surface, we are probably light on what there should be in the deployment of a division. Now, how big is a division? Well, it could be anywhere between 12 to 20,000. Quite a big range of variation. If you look back at, I think the first Gulf War, we deployed what was then first UK armoured division. And that had 3 armoured brigades in it. And then I think we attached 16 air assault brigades, so lots of air mobile troops. And I think that force was over 30,000 under, and that was actually a variety of forces, but the bit that was doing the land stuff was at least 20,000 strong, if not a bit more. That was smaller than Operation Granby, the Gulf War as it's known, but it was still a sizable force. I just don't think we could deploy that today because the numbers are smaller and the range of capabilities aren't there. You also asked, is there any scope for this to change radically? I don't think there is any scope to change it radically. I think they would like to stabilize the size of the army and push it back up above 72,000. But I don't think there's any prospect of the kind of size of force that you would need to have, 2 solid divisions deployable, because what you'd probably want is a force in excess of 80,000 to do that with some resilience. I think what the Chief of the General Staff said was that he wants to double what he called lethality. I hate that term. It's a terrible Americanism. Firepower, combat output. He wants to double that within that 3-year period and do that without increasing the size of the force. And so what he will be proposing as part of this defence review is how do you basically hit harder, move faster, see better, and make yourself much more effective through the use of a combination of tactics and technology and different training, and therefore not have to increase the size of your army. You're just better overall. That's the challenge he's posed himself for the army.
But to kind of play the devil's advocate, is that really possible? Because what he's proposing is basically that in 3 years, the British Army will learn to fight twice as well as before.
No one, I don't think anybody outside really knows. I don't know if he knows. If you ask me hand on heart, I'm not sure if that's possible. But I think it is this. This is that question of, is this part of the conspiracy of optimism or is this leadership? Setting that ambitious target and trying to take the right lessons from Ukraine, got to be careful, and other countries. It does give the army a fighting chance of being able to, I think, improve its output, or at least what it does is it sets a benchmark for the army that says we are lagging modern warfare. We need to be sprinting to catch up. Here is a target. It's almost like having a pacemaker who is moving at world record pace, and you aren't running at world record pace, but you might at least be able to get a national record out of it. I think that's what they're trying to do. The model that he is proposing is not dissimilar to something called network-enabled capability that the UK looked at 25 years ago. And that is essentially a better network of sensors where anything can connect to anything else and move information more rapidly, so we make decisions more quickly than our adversaries. We target more precisely, and therefore we hit at a point that maximizes impact with better firepower that can go further. And if you can do that, you can constantly be one step ahead. Now, I think that's bold, and I think the big bit that it will be challenged by is that one of the lessons of Ukraine is that numbers do still matter. Numbers help you with your firepower. You're putting more stuff out there. They help you inflict more casualties, and they help you take more casualties. There is a danger that what we get is a really capable army that's incredibly dangerous when it has the initiative, but that if it doesn't, it is brittle, that it can't sustain casualties, and that network begins to fall apart in the face of taking losses or being jammed or interfered with. And that is the challenge that the army will have to face up to, is, as we call it, how do you create cheap mass, but that is also effective? It's an area that RUSI is doing research on. It is not easy.
Just a quick break here. In the coming months, I will be starting a newsletter focused on what you need to know and what you might have missed in geopolitics. It's completely free, and you can already sign up for it, and it would be quite helpful if you do that. You can find the link for the sign up in the description below. And now, back to the conversation.
I understand the way that you explained why it's easier, I assume for politicians mostly, to cut numbers in the army rather than in the navy. But I guess that's where it kind of comes to priorities. And if we're talking about preparing for war in Europe, no need to dance around it. We're talking about Russia. And in that context, probably ground forces would be a lot more important than having blue water global navy. So isn't having strong ground forces at this point a little bit more of a necessity for the UK than having a navy?
Well, so I think no, because this is where the UK is caught in a dilemma about what is it that we specialize in and the role that we play. I think it's worth saying the ultimate, or what is often regarded as the ultimate test of your credibility, is your land contribution, because it is the most visible sign that you are making a commitment to the defense of Europe and effectively European security. So, in other words, people have in their mind the idea, fighting and dying in trenches. I mean, trench warfare is back in Ukraine, but the point is the land campaign is the one that is bloody. It's where people live. It is seen as that kind of test of what is it that you are prepared to put in terms of what is colloquially called blood and treasure. And so it is to the UK's discredit that we have spent a long time talking about our contribution on land, but not really contributing in the numbers that we've promised. At the same time, no, the air fight is enormously important in defending Europe because it's one of NATO's great advantages over, let's say, Russia. It's how we offset their ground power and their numbers. And the maritime fight, both above and under the water, is vital. And, I'm not even talking about space and cyberspace here. And that is because traditionally, you need to protect your sea lines of communication because it's where resupply from Europe would come. There's the issue of threat to the UK not being on land in the first instance. It comes from Russian naval forces that can move around the north and threaten from essentially the Arctic Circle, Russian bomber aircraft that could theoretically launch missiles at us. The UK has got to be thinking about all of its flanks. Also, it's specialized in, like, the Royal Navy has been one of the UK's trump cards for years. We glibly say we're an island nation, but that means we have a particular interest in maritime power, protecting our sea lines of communication, protecting trade, what used to be called the unseen principles of national security, that like stability at sea rested on the view that over the horizon there were naval forces that could intervene. And in the case of a war with Russia, the important work of anti-submarine warfare, protecting internet cables, protecting the northern flank through what would be a maritime battle both above and under the water. And so the UK hasn't made its land commitment, but it has often made the argument to NATO, we will play a major role in the maritime battle. It's why the Royal Navy are specialists in anti-submarine warfare, in mine hunting. It's why we've, for a long time, and we cut this capability, but we have it back again now, or it's coming back, specialised in maritime patrol aircraft launched from far north to patrol the North Atlantic. And so I think the problem is that it's not wrong to expect a serious UK land contribution, but the idea that we would do that at the expense of air power and particularly maritime power is kind of a non-starter for a country with both our geographic position and our historical speciality.
I guess that kind of gets us to what you've mentioned in the beginning, and that basically the one of the problems is that the UK is trying to maintain all the capabilities that the US has on a much smaller scale, talking about basically the nuclear triad, which is also expensive, having a navy with a global reach, sufficient air force and land forces. And that's where the question comes of how realistic is that, and to what extent it makes sense to have all this wide range of capabilities if each one of them is quite limited.
Yes, and I think this is something that's going to be challenged in the review, which is that the argument that the UK has made for a long time is that the capabilities that matter in and around Europe can also be used for some of our global commitments, or our desire, our image of ourselves that we have a long-range expeditionary capability, as we call it. We can go a long distance. We're not just a regional defence force. I think the review has already said we're going to look at NATO as both the core of our capability. In other words, do we work well with NATO in a NATO context? But also the driving force for designing our capabilities. In other words, do we need to have things that can go thousands of miles if, as long as we can defend Europe and the UK, that is enough? Now, I don't know where it's going to come out, because there is a lot of logic to that. But things like aircraft carriers, there'll be a hotly contested debate about where do the aircraft carriers sit in the defence of Europe? What role do they seriously play in anti-submarine warfare? Do you put them further north and they effectively act as part of the screen? Or because of the current capability that we've got associated with the carriers, is that actually nice to have but not necessary to have? Would you rather have a navy that was more frigates and destroyers? I think the UK wants those carriers because they are so enormously useful in a broader range of scenarios. But things like range, volume, numbers are all going to come into play, and the start point being NATO first will ask some hard questions. Whether or not we have the wherewithal to answer them honestly and take tough decisions, I don't know, because those kind of things are not just a capability question, they're a political decision.
And I guess that might be a very, very uncomfortable conversation for the UK to have, because basically to answer some of those questions, it might have to kind of re-evaluate how the UK sees itself as a global power.
Yes, and I think we face a sort of dilemma, which is that successive security reviews, so broader than defence, have highlighted that the global context is what is called the global center of gravity, i.e. the concentration of wealth, trade, people and issues has been shifting to the Indo-Pacific. The rise of China, the continued growth in the population in India, the extent to which globalization is moving trade or critical national supplies of material to places like Taiwan and the rest of the Indo-Pacific mean that, in theory, you need a capability to go further. However, at the same time, it's not clear that the UK has a major military role to play in those issues. And for example, the Integrated Review and the Integrated Review Refresh talked about a thing called the Indo-Pacific Tilt. That was never intended to be a military-heavy emphasis. It was a tilt because it wasn't like, oh, we're pivoting our forces there. The tilt was, we need to pay more attention to the Indo-Pacific. We need to think more clearly about what role we play. But it was always intended that that was led by diplomacy, trade, broader economics, and that the military role was sitting beneath the surface. And that's why it's largely been fulfilled by a continued presence of what are called offshore patrol vessels, much smaller ships. And then something like the carrier group visits once every few years. The aim is not to send the carriers to the South China Sea all the time. It's to have a presence in a region of growing importance. And so you can see the logic of saying, well, NATO and Europe is still where the direct military threat is to our most vital interests, i.e. literally the chunk of land, the continent to which we as this island are attached under the sea, and where we have a huge number of British nationals. And that's what drives the need to defend them. And I think that dilemma, you're back to yet again, the concept of how does the UK see itself in the world?
And I guess talking about the Indo-Pacific, the dilemma is that it's very expensive to maintain the capability for the UK to sort of take part and play a role and project power and maybe even engage in whatever way necessary in whatever conflict there might be on the other side of the world. But it's still, even when you pay quite a lot to maintain this capability, the impact or influence or role that the UK would play in the Indo-Pacific would be still very limited compared with all the other actors in the area. So I guess the dilemma is, does it make sense to even have that if you're going to be one of the less important players?
Yes, basically.
I guess then another part of that is the issue of military spending, because the UK could kind of match the ambitions with the capabilities, but it would probably have to spend a lot more on defense than the current medium-term goal of 2.5% GDP. So how do you sort of, what should be the ideal way, or how do you kind of approach that, basically the difference between the defense spending and what the defense spending should Britain aim for, and what role should Britain aspire to have? Where those two meet?
I mean, the whole is almost, the requirement is not quite infinite, but you can always spend more. So this is about matching ambition to resources. The problem at the moment is that the resources don't match the current ambition. So we're currently spending around, I think it's 2.3%. So an increase to 2.5% is not a huge amount. It's not nothing, but it probably only amounts to maybe each year a 10% increase in the defence budget. But it might not even be that. I mean, a lot of this depends on, inflation and actually what GDP is. But you could find yourself spending maybe over a 10-year period, maybe 30 billion extra. Really, really useful, but not game-changing. And we already have at the moment, according to our National Audit Office, a hole in the defence budget of maybe £17 billion. Sorry, a hole in the equipment plan of maybe £17 billion. So you could fill in that hole, and it's growing. and you would have a little bit left over to improve some capabilities and buy some new things. But any radical change of new equipment and new spending on infrastructure, new recruitment of people, would need to be accompanied by cutting something else. So 2.5% is helpful. It's another useful political signal of the direction of travel. It doesn't change the world. To be fair, we're currently spending £56 billion a year, and everybody agrees we need to do better with that money. It's not entirely clear why we can spend that much and get what feels like such a poor return. Now, most people have this challenge. The Americans spend, if you include their operational spending, nearly $1 trillion a year. It's like it's made up. It's like it's a ridiculous figure. It's like Dr. Evil. And they can't meet all of their commitments. But that's because they are genuinely trying to be the global superpower. And that brings with it huge demands. I think what the UK will be looking at is trying to create a more coherent force that fills in those gaps on those important enablers. Things like tankers, which we're short of for the Navy. Things like airborne intelligence, which we are light on. Things like combat engineering support, which we need to get the army going. Stockpiles, weapons, ammunition. First of all, can we create a coherent force that can keep on fighting? Then maybe down the line, can we expand it? But I think the first priority is going to be, can we fill in the gaps in the current force so that UK can deploy something that is UK flagged, that can operate as a coherent sovereign package and really bring something alongside allies with a minimal request on, please, can you help us out in the following areas?
I want to definitely talk about why does the UK seem to have such a small return on investment, but just to stay a little bit longer on the defense spending, the size of it, I think another aspect is that in the past 20 years or so, or 10 years, the UK has basically always been giving above the 2% of GDP as one of the few European countries. And so it was kind of staying at the top of or ahead of the pact. And now, as all the European countries are increasing their defense spending budgets, and as a lot of Eastern European countries are pushing towards 3% and above, I guess if the UK still wanted to be around the top, it would have to kind of move closer to 3% as well. But do you think that is realistically possible, given all the constraints of the British economy? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.